July 1, 1944, Hollandia Air Base, New Guinea. 4 P-38 Lightnings touched down after 6.5 hours over enemy territory. 3 pilots climbed out exhausted, their fuel gauges hovering near empty. Barely 50 gallons left in each tank. The fourth aircraft, flown by a 42-year-old civilian, still showed 210 gallons remaining. Same weather, same aircraft, same mission. Yet somehow, this man had burned 200 gallons less fuel than the best fighter pilots in the Pacific. The ground crew chief checked his fuel stick twice, thinking it had to be wrong. For months, American pilots had flown their twin-engine Lightnings exactly as the manuals dictated. 200 RPM auto, rich mixture, following every procedure they had been drilled on since flight school. They'd been warned that deviating from these numbers would destroy their engines. Running, over, square, high manifold pressure with low RPM was supposed to be aviation suicide. But on that New Guinea airstrip, staring at fuel readings that defied everything they'd been taught, one question began to echo through the humid air. What if everything they'd learned about flying was wrong? The knock came just as the checker game reached its 20th minute. Colonel Charles MacDonald barely looked up from the board, still thinking 3 moves ahead while the heavy afternoon heat pressed down on the tent at Hollandia Air Base. Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith sat opposite, equally absorbed, a rare moment of leisure in a war where such things were scarce. "Excuse me, gentlemen." The voice was calm, authoritative, and unfamiliar. MacDonald looked up to see a middle-aged man in navy khakis standing at the doorway, uniform pressed despite the damp air. "I'm Charles Lindbergh." MacDonald's hand froze halfway to a checker piece. The name hung in the air like gun smoke. Smith's eyes widened, and for a moment, the tent seemed unnaturally still. "That Charles Lindbergh?" MacDonald asked quietly. "The one who flew solo to Paris?" Lindbergh nodded. "General Hutchinson sent me," he said, stepping inside. "He thought I might discuss P-38 combat operations with you." At 29, MacDonald commanded the 475th Fighter Group, but he had grown up reading about Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic. To every American pilot, the Spirit of St. Louis wasn't just an airplane. It was a legend the moment aviation became something more than daredevil stunts. And now, here stood the man himself, asking to talk about their daily fight across the Pacific. MacDonald gestured to a chair. "Of course, Mr. Lindbergh, please sit. Colonel Warren Lewis should be here too. He runs our 433rd Squadron." Lewis arrived within minutes, flight suit still damp with sweat from the morning briefing. He took one look at Lindbergh and blinked in disbelief. "Mr. Lindbergh, what brings you to our little corner of paradise?" he asked, the irony not lost on anyone. Paradise, muddy runways, endless rain, swarming insects, and constant fatigue. But his question was genuine. What did the most famous pilot in the world want with their operations? "I'm here to learn," Lindbergh replied simply, "and maybe share some observations about long-range flying." Lewis nodded, clearing a space on MacDonald's desk and spreading a map. "We're pushing these planes harder than anyone expected," he began. His finger traced their routes over the blue expanse of the Pacific. Hundreds of miles between scattered islands, each one a tiny lifeline in an ocean that swallowed pilots whole. 6.5 to 7 hours in the air, that's what we're asking of them now. It's brutal. We've got missions that were impossible a year ago, and the fuel margins. He stopped, shaking his head. "We're flying on fumes." Lindbergh studied the map silently, pale blue eyes moving across the islands. It was the gaze of someone who thought in miles and hours, who understood that every drop of fuel was time. Time to fight, time to live, or time to die. "The P-38L has a published combat radius of 5 of 70 miles, Lewis continued. "In practice, we push that every time. Standard settings to 200 to 400 RPM auto, rich mixture. Fuel consumption runs a bit over 100 gallons per hour total." Lindbergh nodded thoughtfully, and MacDonald caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes. Not surprise, but understanding. Lewis went on, voice wary from repetition. "7 hours in that cockpit is torture. You're sitting on a chute and a raft, fighting fatigue, watching fuel gauges drop. Every mission becomes math. How long we can stay over target, where our point of no return lies. MacDonald had seen it too often. Young men with pencils and slide rules, calculating survival on paper before climbing into their planes. Many never returned. The Pacific didn't forgive empty tanks. And it's getting worse, Lewis added. The war's moving west. Rabaul, Wewak, now the Philippines. Every new target is farther away. Our planes aren't growing any bigger. Lindbergh's questions came precisely, technical and exacting. He asked about propeller pitch, manifold pressure, and fuel-air ratios with a mechanic's curiosity. It wasn't the conversation of a celebrity. This was an engineer and pilot who understood machines intimately. Have you experimented with alternate cruise settings? Lindbergh asked. Lewis exchanged a look with MacDonald. We follow the manuals, he said cautiously. High RPM, rich mixture. That's what keeps these Allisons alive. Lindbergh tilted his head slightly, not arguing but clearly thinking otherwise. Mr. Lindbergh, MacDonald said, you mentioned long-range flying experience. What kind of observations are we talking about? Lindbergh's faint smile appeared for the first time. Would you be interested in a demonstration? I've checked out in the P-38 already. I'd like to fly a combat mission with your group. MacDonald hesitated. Taking a civilian, especially Lindbergh, into combat was risky, bordering on reckless. But there was something in the man's quiet confidence that felt steady. What did you have in mind? 2 days later, the recreation hall at Hollandia filled with pilots. The heat was oppressive, the floor hard, packed dirt, a few light bulbs flickering overhead. 43 men, most under 25, sat waiting. MacDonald stood beside a wooden crate serving as a podium. Gentlemen, he began, Mr. Lindbergh has something he wants to share about fuel management. Lindbergh stepped forward, his presence understated but commanding. Reduce your standard suit, 200 RPM to 1600. He said immediately, no preamble. Set mixture to auto, lean, not auto-rich. Increase manifold pressure slightly to compensate. The room went silent. The pilots stared, processing what sounded like heresy. Lieutenant Bobby Johnson finally raised his hand. Sir, are you saying run 1600 RPM with 30 inches of manifold pressure? That's correct. Lindbergh replied. You'll save 50 to 100 gallons per mission, depending on conditions. The silence deepened. Every pilot in the room had been taught since day one, never run over square. It meant detonation, engine failure, death. Captain Jim Watkins broke the tension. Mr. Lindbergh, that's suicide. Low RPM, high manifold pressure. It'll burn the engines. You've been told wrong. Lindbergh said evenly. You're not pushing both high. You're maintaining power with pressure while lowering RPM. That reduces friction and heat. Combine it with lean mixture, and your total consumption drops to about 70 gallons an hour. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes scribbled numbers. That's 30% less fuel. He murmured. Lindbergh nodded. At 185 miles per hour indicated, that's 2.6 miles per gallon. Extends your range to 700, maybe 750 miles. The pilots glanced at each other. 700 miles meant striking deep into enemy territory. Missions that were impossible yesterday. But belief was harder than math. Every manual says it'll destroy our engines. Major Pete Peterson objected. Risk of knock, piston damage. The manuals were written by engineers, not by men flying 6-hour missions. Lindbergh interrupted calmly. Those settings are for short-range training, not endurance. You've been protecting engines at the cost of operational range. Lieutenant Colonel Smith spoke next, voice edged with fatigue. You're asking men to fly 9-hour missions. 7 hours already feels endless. The human factor matters too. I understand, Lindbergh said. But you're already losing men to fuel starvation. How many haven't made it back because they ran dry over the Pacific? The silence that followed was answer enough. Too many had vanished without a trace. This isn't about comfort. Lindbergh continued quietly. It's about survival. MacDonald scanned the faces around him. Skeptical, cautious, but listening. Would you demonstrate this technique yourself? He asked finally. The morning of July 3rd dawned bright and windless. MacDonald stood beside his P-38 as mechanics completed pre-flight checks. The mission, 280 miles round trip, would push the limits of every calculation. Lindbergh emerged from the operations tent in a borrowed flight suit, his gear arranged with meticulous order. Even his calm movements carried the quiet precision of habit built over years in the cockpit. "Good weather for a test," he said, glancing east toward the rising sun. "Visibility should hold." "Tommy Maguire's your wingman," MacDonald said. Major Maguire, second highest scoring ace in the Pacific, would observe Lindbergh's every move. If Lindbergh's method worked for him, it could work for anyone. Lindbergh climbed into his cockpit, adjusting his mixture to auto, lean before start up. A detail no combat pilot had ever dared. The twin Allisons started smoothly, their tone deeper and quieter than usual. "Hollandia Tower, lightning flight ready for takeoff," MacDonald called. "Cleared runway 27, came the reply. The four Lightnings lifted off in formation and climbed toward the northeast. Even in the climb, MacDonald noticed Lindbergh's engine sounded different, steady, restrained. At cruise altitude, Lindbergh came over the radio, reducing to 1600 RPM, manifold 30 inches. Mixture auto, lean, airspeed 185. MacDonald checked his own gauges. His plane burned over 100 gallons per hour total. Lindbergh's seemed to keep pace with half the sound and, apparently, far less fuel. An hour and a half in, Maguire's voice crackled through the radio. "Lead, my flow's 20% lower than usual." He wasn't even trying the full method, just unconsciously flying smoother to match Lindbergh. Efficiency was contagious. 2 hours later, they spotted Japanese barge traffic near Samate Island. "Lightning flight, prepare for attack," MacDonald ordered. They dove, strafing through flak and smoke. Lindbergh stayed tight in formation, his engines responding perfectly even at combat power. After 12 minutes of chaos, they regrouped and climbed back to altitude. "Full check," MacDonald called. 60%, Maguire replied. 58, another pilot said. 72, Lindbergh reported. MacDonald blinked. "Say again." 70, 2% remaining, Lindbergh repeated calmly. "Average fuel flow 70 gallons per hour total." MacDonald stared at his gauges. He'd used nearly 200 gallons already. Lindbergh had burned only 140. It wasn't a small margin. It was revolutionary. The flight home sealed it. Lindbergh's Lightning returned to Hollandia with 34% of its fuel still in the tanks. The others landed near empty. Ground crews verified the numbers twice. The myth was becoming fact. Technical Sergeant Mike Kowalski, veteran crew chief, stared at the readings in disbelief. "Either this guy's flying magic engines," he muttered, "or everything we've been told about these Allisons is wrong." A MacDonald didn't argue. Mission after mission, Lindbergh repeated the results. 30% savings, flawless performance, and engines that showed no sign of stress. Lieutenant Hayes tried it next on a training flight. Felt wrong the whole time, he admitted, like waiting for an explosion. But he landed with fuel gauges that didn't lie. 73 gallons per hour total, down from over 100. Major Peterson held out longest, skeptical to the end. "You're asking us to bet our lives on theory," he said. Lindbergh shook his head. "Not theory, Major. Practice. You've been trained to protect engines at the cost of mission capability." By the end of July, skepticism began to crumble. On the 28th, MacDonald planned a major strike against Wewak, 400 miles out, with heavy Japanese air presence. Lindbergh flew on Maguire's wing. If his technique worked here, in real combat, it would silence all doubt. They met a formation of Japanese Ki-51 dive bombers escorted by Zeros. The sky erupted into chaos. MacDonald watched as the battle spiraled into the clouds, P-38s and Zeros weaving deadly patterns. Lindbergh's aircraft stayed calm, his movements efficient and measured, even under fire. When a Japanese fighter broke toward him in a ramming dive, Lindbergh reacted instantly. One burst, one hit, the Zero spiraled down in smoke. It was his only aerial victory of the war, but it proved something deeper. Efficiency didn't mean weakness. It meant control. After 8 hours in the air, they turned home. Everyone expected to land with tanks dry. Instead, they touched down at Hollandia with comfortable reserves. MacDonald had fuel for another hour of flight. Maguire too. Lindbergh, Enough for nearly 2 more hours. Post-flight inspections revealed no damage. Engines clean. Plugs perfect, oil normal. Kowalski's grin said everything. "Sir, if this is over square, I hope we all run it forever." Word spread like wildfire. Even the skeptics began asking for demonstrations. The impossible had become standard. By early August 1944, the transformation at Hollandia was unmistakable. Every squadron in the 475th Fighter Group had adopted Lindbergh's cruise settings. 600 RPM, 30 inches manifold pressure, auto, lean mixture. Mission logs began to show results that bordered on unbelievable. Fuel consumption dropped by a third, range increased by more than 150 miles, and engine wear, despite every dire prediction, actually decreased. Mechanics reported cleaner spark plugs, smoother idling, and fewer maintenance issues after long flights. Pilots who once returned on fumes now landed with enough in reserve to circle the field twice. The skepticism had not disappeared, but it had turned into curiosity. Pilots began experimenting within the limits Lindbergh demonstrated. They learned how to adjust throttle and prop pitch with precision, how to feel the subtle vibrations that told them when the mixture was just right. Training sessions grew informal but serious, every man eager to master the new technique. Lindbergh, meticulous as ever, moved from cockpit to cockpit, explaining patiently how fuel efficiency was not about rules, but about understanding the machine. "You don't force the engines," he said. "You let them breathe. Too much speed, and you're dragging through the air. Too much power, and you're wasting it as heat. Find the point where thrust meets silence. That's where endurance lives." Lieutenant Hayes described flying beside him as eerie. "He didn't look like he was fighting the airplane," he said. "He looked like part of it." After one mission, Hayes compared his logs and found he had burned 90 gallons more fuel than Lindbergh over the same route and altitude. "He was like a ghost out there," Hayes told MacDonald. "Same distance, same power settings, but he just floated." That precision began to ripple far beyond Hollandia. Word of Lindbergh's method reached the 8th Fighter Group, then the 49th, and soon across the entire 5th Air Force. By September, even bomber crews were experimenting with similar techniques in their B-24s, cautiously lowering RPM and leaning mixtures for range. In a theatre where islands stretched like stepping stones across 1,000 miles of ocean, those extra minutes of flight time meant everything. On August 28th, MacDonald received orders for a long-range escort to Mindanao. The target was nearly 650 miles away, at the absolute limit of their aircraft's range even with drop tanks. Command considered it barely possible, but MacDonald felt confident now. "We'll make it," he told his officers. "Mimstre. Lindbergh's proven we can." Lindbergh stood quietly at the edge of the tent, folding map sheets, offering corrections to the navigation plan. He wasn't there to lead, only to advise, yet every man deferred to him instinctively. They took off at dawn, 2 P-30As gleaming silver in the light. The formation climbed smoothly, throttles set to the new standard. 2 hours into the flight, fuel flow meters told the story. Every aircraft was running cooler and leaner than ever before. They reached the target, escorted bombers through anti-aircraft fire, and turned for home after 4.5 hours in the air. Not a single plane ran dry. When they landed, each pilot still had 80 to 100 gallons remaining. The success stunned higher command. What had been deemed a borderline suicide mission had been completed without a single loss. MacDonald's after-action report was factual and restrained, but his closing line said it all. Recommend immediate adoption of revised cruise procedures developed by civilian consultant Charles A. Lindbergh. Technique has proven decisive in extending range and conserving fuel under combat conditions. Copies of that report travelled swiftly up the chain of command to General George Kenny, commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific. Kenny had met Lindbergh earlier in the year and admired his technical mind, but even he hadn't anticipated such results. Within days, Kenny ordered demonstrations for other fighter groups. Lindbergh personally flew from base to base, sometimes making 4 flights a day, repeating the experiment with each new audience. The pattern never failed. Same load, same distance, same weather. Kenny later wrote, and he always came home with 50% more fuel. By mid-September, the new technique had transformed tactical planning. Targets once considered unreachable now fell within range. Pilots struck deeper into Japanese positions, surprised convoys that believed themselves safe, and returned home with fuel to spare. The P-38's operational radius, once limited to 570 miles, now stretched past 750. Missions to the Palau Islands, to the Celebes, even to the approaches of the Philippines, suddenly became possible. The impact was not just technical, it was psychological. Pilots no longer saw the fuel gauge as a slow death clock. They could fight longer, escort farther, and survive the long journeys over open water that had claimed so many of their friends. The change in confidence was visible in every briefing room. What had once been desperation had become mastery. MacDonald often found Lindbergh alone in the evenings, seated on an overturned crater outside the operations tent, writing notes by lantern light. When asked what he was recording, Lindbergh simply said, "Numbers. Every flight tells a story if you listen to it." His logbooks filled with columns of figures. Fuel flows, temperatures, airspeeds, pressures. Each entry another step in proving what instinct and experience had already told him. But not everyone celebrated. In Washington, Lindbergh's name still carried controversy from his pre-war political statements. Officially, he was a civilian consultant for United Aircraft Corporation, not a military officer. He was prohibited from combat. When word reached the War Department that he had not only flown combat missions, but also shot down a Japanese fighter, protests followed swiftly. Orders came down forbidding him to fly further operations. MacDonald received the directive with quiet frustration. "He's done more for our group than any staff officer back home," he said bitterly. And they ground him for politics. Lindbergh accepted it without complaint. "It's their war," he said. "I'm only borrowing it for a little while." Still, his influence could not be undone. The manuals were rewritten, the techniques standardized, and the new cruise settings became doctrine. When Lindbergh left Hollandia in October, the entire 475th gathered at the airstrip to see him off. Maguire shook his hand firmly. "You didn't just teach us to save fuel," he said. "You taught us to think for ourselves again." Lindbergh smiled faintly. "That's all flying ever is, thinking for yourself." After he departed, the legacy continued. The 475th led the air offensive toward the Philippines, their P-30As striking farther and harder than anyone thought possible. The same principles Lindbergh taught, efficiency, mechanical sympathy, precise control, filtered into later aircraft and even into post-war jet operations. When engineers analyzed the data after the war, they confirmed what field experience had shown running, over, square, under controlled conditions produced lower cylinder wear, cooler operation, and significant range gains. What had once been dismissed as dangerous became the foundation of modern engine management. In later years, pilots who had flown with him would recall not just the technique, but the man himself. He wasn't charismatic in the usual sense, quiet, distant, almost awkward. But in the cockpit he radiated a calm that steadied everyone around him. He never raised his voice, never gave orders. He simply demonstrated, and the results spoke louder than any speech could. Colonel MacDonald summarized it best in his memoir, "We'd been told that rules keep engines alive. Lindbergh showed us that understanding keeps pilots alive." The difference was everything. Long after the war ended, mechanics still repeated fragments of his lessons. Lean, low RPM, steady hand, as they trained new generations of flyers. What began as one man's experiment on a humid New Guinea runway became part of aviation's collective wisdom. Every modern pilot who stretches range through mixture control or low RPM cruise owes something, knowingly or not, to that summer of 1944 when a civilian stepped into a war zone and changed how men flew. The Pacific campaign moved on, battles shifting north toward Luzon and Okinawa. Many of the pilots who learned from Lindbergh would not live to see the end, but their surviving reports, the logbooks filled with hand-written fuel charts, told the story clearly. Range meant survival. Precision meant victory. And behind those numbers was one man's refusal to accept that standard procedure had to be final truth. Years later, When asked why he risked combat to teach something so simple, Lindbergh answered in the same measured tone he had used at Hollandia, because every rule is written by someone who stopped learning. In the air, you never stop. And so, in the long, hot summer of 1944, on muddy airstrips carved into the jungles of New Guinea, a single idea, quiet, methodical, proven by example, extended the reach of an entire air force. The miracle wasn't in the machines, it was in the understanding of them. Every drop of fuel saved carried men a little farther from death and a little closer to victory. And that, more than any record or medal, was Charles Lindbergh's true contribution to the war in the Pacific.